Of course, yeah. So my name is Phil Salvador. I am 30 years old. I am based out of Silver Spring, Maryland, in the D.C. area. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been writing a blog about, unusual, old, mostly computer games, but everything in kind of the video game software space. I think it's the kind of thing where I think, as with a lot of this kind of old game stuff, it started from me looking back at, like, things I played as a kid and getting excited about it again. But as I got more into it, I realized there was so much interesting stuff, games, software, stories, histories that just had kind of fallen by the wayside in favor of sort of a leaner narrative of games where it's, Nintendo and Sega and Atari and all that. And so as time goes on, I just became more invested in this idea of sort of revisiting stuff we've left behind, looking at things that maybe they were briefly popular, maybe they were never popular, and just kind of giving them a second look and see what's interesting and unique about them. What are some of the stories behind them? I think there's just a lot of merit in exploring some of that, and so over the last 10 years, this project has just kind of evolved over time to start, I guess, both broadening and getting more specific, just kind of casting a larger net and seeing what kind of things are interesting to me, I guess.
Gotcha. Yeah. I'll do that a bit, where I'll sort of hang back in case you're like connecting to another thought, because I really want to try to avoid interrupting you. But I guess just to go even further back, so what is the Obscuritory, what motivated you to start it and when, and a little bit about you, what's your background where you were in a place where you were this makes sense for me to do that, or did it not make sense to you as it was dawning on you?
Well, it's kind of a couple things. Again, things just sort of came in stages with this and cohered over time. When it started out, I think, again, this is sort of a natural starting point for a lot of people looking back at old games, but I had just started college, and I was thinking about a lot of the, the CD-ROM stuff I had grown up playing, some of the adventure gamey type stuff. And there was a particular one I had that was lodged in my head. It was a game I had half a memory of. It was a really surreal game with a giant green head, and I couldn't really place it. And partway through my first semester in college, I learned what this thing was, and it was absolutely fascinating. It was a game called Eastern Mind. It's this very philosophical, allegorical game. And something just lodged in my head with that. It was this game is fascinating. I'm amazed by this. I want to share this with somebody. And that just eventually kind of evolved into, I should probably start a blog about this. I had always wanted to have my own game site. And so it was maybe I could talk about this a little more at length. And it was always kind of this weird side thing. I was going to school for political science, which didn't end up happening, even though I'm still in the D.C. area. But I think what happened over time was I eventually went down the path of becoming a librarian. I went to library school, got my master's in library science, and at some point there, everything also clicked, and it was this thinking about the management and preservation of information and arts and culture colliding with this interest in these old games that are tough to play now and no one really talks about anymore. And at some point, those things coalesced, and it was there's something here. There's something about this intersection of critique and looking back at history and dealing with preservation, all these questions kind of colliding. That was super. It started out just me looking at these weird games, and it was what a friend I think once described as being "Hey, smell this" writing, where we're just look at this weird thing. And I, to an extent, I still do like that. It's there's a merit just being look at this weird old thing. But
yeah,
I think just kind of
Is "Hey, smell this" writing anything does this look infected? To you writing.
Exactly, yeah. Just that kind of again, I think there's a merit in just look at this weird old thing. Isn't this neat?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the about on your website, and then eventually we'll go further off-site, but you have a quote from Rachel Simone Weil. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. That's the thing about written interviews, is people never know how I'm pronouncing things. You have a quote from her about bygone video games and software have the power to inspire the next generation of dreamers. And so, I mean, what have you found typically is most inspiring about these older games you're looking at among readers you have who are younger than yourself?
That's a good question. I think it's a couple things. I think there is, because I do have some younger readers who have been interested in this stuff, which I'm really excited about, because I think if I'm just talking to people who are in their like mid-30s, I'm not totally like, so I'm glad that it has a younger audience. But I think it's a combination of things. I think one of it is there's a willingness to experiment with different modes of expression that I think is mirrored in some of this like early CD-ROM multimedia stuff. I think it was the Smithsonian was the first place I heard refer to this era in games, like the 90s era, as being like the transitional era, where people were figuring out how to present things, how to work with 3D graphics, how to take advantage of being able to use like high quality sound and video. So you ended up with some really kind of chaotic modes of presentation, and I feel like that has really resonated with a lot of people. The idea of just being kind of openly fearless about exploring some of these things that can be done with color and graphics and motion. To an extent, I think a part of it is also, people seeing other ideas represented in games that, may have been discarded to an extent. I think that there's some obvious kind of like hallmarks of big games that, I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this even, but
well, you're talking about like the multimedia era and like the time where like a lot of these, even like the internet, I guess, is part of it too. The internet that we use to the most widely, not the internet technology, but the World Wide Web, but also just like a bit of like, you had like tastemaker artists like Peter Gabriel and David Bowie, like talking about.
Laurie Anderson did a CD-ROM, yeah.
Exactly. We're talking. I mean, I think there was just like this intense excitement and like feeling of like, and I think there was still some residual glow of like people still felt like it hadn't been as codified yet of like this is what a video game is and what it should be. And I think that's true for like people who made it, but also for people who played it too. Like that's sort of the time you're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes with, like, again, some of the ways that the line between, like, games and what was not a game was kind of blurred, like the existence of things like software toys, or even, which is like little widgets you play around with and screensavers and things that, like, aren't exactly games, but they're kind of games. Or just, like, even, like, old educational software, like, there's, like, a promotional CD-ROM about, like, fruits and vegetables that kind of straddles the line between all those kind of, like, it's in the same like universe as a Laurie Anderson CD-ROM, but just I think there's people enjoy the sort of connections between all those things. I get the sense of just the everything being thrown at a wall and things kind of sticking together in different places.
So, and I think too, like, so it's not just my understanding based on my familiarity with your work is like it's not just about like odd curios and curiosities. Like I know you had a thing this year, I believe, although my sense of time this year is totally off, but like you actually you broke some news about if you want to talk about like how this digging you've been doing, how it yielded, like you actually
we're talking about Sim Refinery, right?
That's Sim Refinery, exactly.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah.
So this was one of those things where as I was just exploring all these kind of different games, and this is one of those areas where like the curiosity kind of peeking to this bigger project was I was exploring Maxis, which was the developer of SimCity and The Sims, and they made so many other different kind of curious software toy type games. And as I was doing research on that, I was looking at all the weird Sim Town and Sim Ant and all those things. They did a realistic model of a healthcare system, which was like Sim Health, which was fascinating to me. And as I looked more into it, they had a division of their company that made like serious simulation games, and nobody had written about this before. Like it was a largely unknown thing, despite it's like the creators of SimCity had a division that made a game for the Chevron Oil Corporation, which was just fascinating to me. And again, it started out with that kind of curiosity, like what on earth was this? And then as I got deeper, I spent a couple years just tracking down and interviewing folks who worked on these things, and it kind of blossomed from just like a trivia fact, like, whoa, they made this weird game about an oil company, into this bigger story about like the ambition of software colliding with capitalism, and it was I'm surprised like that this has not been a thing before on like it's in fact like this story was buried for so long, but it was fascinating, and it just kind of grew out of that sort of poking and prodding at odd things until it was like there's something bigger here. And I think that's kind of been the story of doing this over time. Was again, it started out just kind of poking and prodding at odd games, but I think there's a fascinating story behind all this stuff that it always opens up to some bigger story or somebody's bigger life story, and that's worth. I can't always do that because it took a long time and it's kind of exhausting, but But yeah, it's yeah.
Well, I had a thing. I mean, I had a thing a couple of years ago, not nearly on the scale you did. I don't know if you remember there were. This is in that era we were just talking about, so we should. This will also shade it in as not necessarily being full of amazing creative breakthroughs. That there were other facets to it too, and I'm not at all knocking on it because these are the sorts of things I really like to dig into. So maybe elsewhere on the same tangent, there was a parody version of Myst called Pissed.
Oh yeah.
And years ago, I was in San Francisco for the Game Developer Conference, and through the sort of digging you're talking about, I had found, and I don't know, it may have been through Moby Games. I'm not sure where I found the list of. It's probably just the weird, meticulous LinkedIn random searching I'll do. I found someone who had worked on Pissed, was still in the Bay Area, still working in software, and he was very. And of course I have to reach out and be like, well, I'm going to be in town and I would love to meet you and talk at length about this decades-old obscure parody game you worked on to a much more popular but arguably still somewhat obscure video game. And he was, very accommodating. He invited me up to his office, he was working a different job, and he just let me come in and stick a recorder on the desk and interview him. And I had found out through that conversation that they had worked on another parody. They wanted to capitalize on whatever success they had with Pissed and make a parody of Doom called Doof, which I had never heard of, had never seen anything about. And he claimed that they pitched it and just things crumbled with the studio. I don't know if they ever made any version of it at all, but he sent me photos of through a glass table in his house. So it's all these weird reflections of a mock-up of the box they used in the pitch. And I was like, what do I do with this information? It's wow. This is some sort of wrinkle of human knowledge that is missing, because it was news to me. But it's so, I mean, do you feel, so I know that the Sim Refinery thing, it did, and it may just be in the circles we run in, but I had heard about it. I guess when you do this digging, can you talk a little bit about well, what pipelines are there to let it be known that these things are known now? Do you feel more people need to know about these sorts of discoveries? Because I just feel there's a constant, the line is always that we're losing game history every day, things aren't being archived in a sufficient way, and there's just a loss of knowledge. I mean, that's a very minor example, Doof. But but sometimes it's I wonder well, are there just pipelines that are missing, or is it just people aren't hearing about it? What's your feeling about it? Because I assume you're not. Are you just documenting this for yourself, or you want to contribute to something bigger, or do you not think about it that way?
That's a good question, and I think it's, for me, a big part of it, and this I think ties into some of my previous history on the internet as a kid and stuff, is I think viewpoint is a huge part of it for me. Yeah. Is that a lot of the things I write about for the blog or get curious about, I think often have gotten dismissed as being trivia facts, or as being, the game is terrible, and that's what's interesting about it, is it goes on a website of here's these terrible games, which was really common the early 2000s internet, where it was all the white dudes getting mad at video game stuff. And I think what matters to me more than any specific story or anything is pushing, moving the dialogue in a way where when someone sees a weird old thing like that, the inclination is to be curious about it and to be excited about it and to want to learn more about what was behind it. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes in games that kind of attitude is reserved for, the classics, basically, for the really big games that everyone knows, which I was kind of mentioning earlier. But I think if we can get towards a place where you look at something like the Myst parody, and instead of, I think a lot of people might have looked at that and just kind of, dismissed it for being garbage, which maybe it's not great, but wanting to know more about like the story behind it, or like who cared about this thing, or like even when the people were publishing it, like what did they see in this thing? Like just having a broader mind about how you want to approach things, I think is that for me is maybe the most important part. I enjoy writing these articles. I excuse me. I like diving into the history of them. I'm excited when some of that gets picked up or spread more broadly. But I think also it's getting to the point where when you look at something weird and old, not dismissing it, but just kind of getting interested in why it is the way it is. I remember sorry, go on, please.
No, you please go ahead. That was my I'm interested weird tongue noise there.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
This is a weird anecdote, but it was a story. Oh, I think it was Harrison Ford gave an interview with GQ a while ago, and he had a story about like every day walking up a hill and some kids would push him back down again, and he wasn't even thinking about it like, why are they bullying me? He was just like, well, that's interesting, why are they doing that? Like, he was so detached and removed from it. And I feel like my approach to games is slowly moving in that direction, where when I play something, it's not even like, is it good or bad, but I just kind of look at it and think like, well, who is this for, and who called the shots on this?
Yeah.
And like, why, I know this is a really interesting thing that happens in the game, like not even necessarily like what motivated it, but just being interested in different qualities that come out, as opposed to just dismissing it or writing it off for being this weird, as you mentioned earlier, like a curio.
Yeah. I mean, I relate to that a lot. I mean, obviously, hopefully, obviously, it's not. I just said it was obvious. It was obvious to me, and I think that's sort of like a growing pains thing that is still. Depends which direction and what direction the wind is blowing in. Like it feels like there's still a lot of that, but then I look around and there's a growing number of people doing, or even if they're not doing quite what you're doing, there's obviously an interest in it, which I think is tied to like wanting to know why, like wanting to know about things be deeper beyond the surface and the people involved with these things. And so, I mean, I mentioned a little bit about like my experience, meeting face to face with this guy. In your research, when you interact with primary sources, when you have occasion to, is there a general way they react to your work? Because I feel like I understand the why from the person who didn't make it side, but for the person who did make it, I don't know, maybe it's false modesty, maybe it's something else, but to act as though like the whole spectrum of humanity that interacts with this thing and like really no one's interested is I don't think it's true, so when you do bump into these types of people yourself, people who have worked on the things you've worked on or that are digging into, like what is there a typical response, or does it run the gamut?
I think it runs the gamut.
Yeah.
I think just how people have related to their work as their life has gone on, because I think about this too, that like it's not just, these are people's life's history too, like these are like something they worked on earlier in their career, so that has a personal relationship with it to an extent. So sometimes you get people who are surprised or curious that I wanted to speak about it. Some people who have a big pile of stuff ready in case anyone ever wanted to talk about it.
Yep.
There are some folks who are definitely take greater pride in it. Occasionally, infrequently, you'll get someone who's not interested and doesn't want to discuss it anymore. I think it really just comes down to what their own relationship with that stuff was, which again, people's lives vary so much, so that varies so much, which I realize is not a very definitive answer, but I think you get a sense of like, I don't know, the level of pride isn't the right word, but just the relationship they have with their work. You kind of get from how they respond to wanting to learn more about these things, if that makes sense.
So do you have any examples that come to mind of people who had the break in case of emergency collections for, someday someone will come knocking, the people will want to know. What are experiences you've had? Like, is there any like who are the people who you've run into with that? Yeah.
So there's one specific, and it's Maxis related again, kind of totally unrelated to the Sim Refinery stuff, but there was a program. Well, just because I've spoken to a lot of folks from Maxis,
No,
so
it's
this
fine.
This
It's
just came up.
interesting. Because I was thinking a lot of my stories like that I shared with you also have to do with Doom in some way. Maybe it's something about our biorhythms and the beacons we put down. We can't help that these things find their ways to us. So yeah, please continue.
Well, in this case, it was a person who has been ready for this his entire life. It was a programmer at Maxis named Don Hopkins who worked. I think he was at Maxis in like late 90s, early 2000s. So he was one of the programmers on The Sims. And he kept just about everything. He has like old design documents and like with like handwritten notes on just all of this material. And he will just like occasionally be like, hey, check this out. I recorded a YouTube video of the prototype of The Sims we brought to EA. Just like all this incredible stuff he's just been like had in a pile somewhere. And as soon as he realized people wanted to know about it, here it's just like a smorgasbord of just material. And it's great and it's exciting. And not everyone like has that level of stuff. There have been other times where it's something I haven't written about yet, but there was an old point-and-click game that has a lot of live-action elements to it that I reached out to the director of it and asked, like, what was the production of this like? And he happened to have kept just like a mountain of photos from when they were working on it, like just taking pictures of stuff. And I seemed to be very proud of his work and had just kept it squirreled away and was like, yeah, I'll send you some photos if you want to see them. And I still need to follow up on that, which I really should as I'm saying this out loud.
Yeah.
But yes, sometimes people just like they'll have kept their work organized because they have a sense of pride in it. And as soon as someone comes along, they are happy to bust it out and talk about it. And it's great. And definitely not everyone has that level of I guess personal organization. A lot more of the time you hear people who are like, yeah, I have some stuff, it's in a storage unit, or it's it'll be a pain to figure out what still works, I'll get back to you, and then that never happens. So those are unique, or not unique, but much less frequent, I guess.
What tends to be the norm? Just people have kind of moved on, or they forget, or it's they don't have it anymore, or.
It's a lot of don't have it anymore, or a lot of I've got something on a hard drive somewhere, I should look for that. That kind of thing. So that to use Sim Refinery, because that was kind of the most extensive ones I researched in this way, like specifically looking for materials about this stuff because there wasn't really anything written about it. I spoke with a lot of the developers at the business division of Maxis that made these games, and they had some stuff lying around. I think one of the programmers said like he said like he had a box somewhere at one point, and just wasn't sure. I mean, it could have been an attic, could have been storage. So that kind. I think people holding on to things because they realize it's matters to an extent, but then just not really being sure how to get it, especially when it's my blog never really has like deadlines or anything like that, so it's not like it's so just a lot of, or I think maybe one of the people at Chevron I spoke to, who, now he wasn't at Chevron still, but had said like, yeah, I think I have something about that somewhere, I just can't be, I really don't want to get that out. It's like, that's how it is. It's like people's lives are messy. If you ask me to find something in my like drawer over here, I probably couldn't. It's a giant mess of stuff. So, I mean, I get that, but it's definitely it's important to at least see if people have anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's understandable, and just that's life, and that's people for you, and I think it's not really that connected to something else you were talking about that also sort of contributes to how in the shadows some of this stuff can be. You had mentioned that there can be a tunnel vision focus on how much games make, the revenue produced from these games, and
yeah.
I wonder. I mean, I don't really know who, if you're going to pin it on like how that got to be such a focus. Like obviously it is companies and some is media. I don't know if the end player really cares that much, even though they're part of it. But I mean, how much of that tunnel vision focus on revenue over, I don't know over what else, but like just that how much of that tunnel vision do you think comes from people making games, or this sort of attitude of like, well, that's something I did in the past. Like, is there more you think, even if they don't hold on to stuff themselves, is there more you think people, working at game companies today could do to sort of combat that tunnel vision that you're talking about?
Well, I think I'm trying to think how to approach this one. Um, I think now, I think there's definitely no doubt that games are a big cultural force. I think everyone recognizes that. But I think a lot of the growing pains came, and this is might be rambling. Hopefully, I'll get to something resembling an answer. But I think a lot of the sort of need to like justify games with the industry makes X billion dollars comes from needing to justify it to other people, to saying hey, games do matter culturally. If you're saying that to like either investors or like in academia, if you're trying to attract interest in your gaming department and prove that it's relevant and worth studying. I think it's not necessarily. So I'm thinking now about like the folks who maybe not dismissive of their work, but that it's something that they don't necessarily see as being super historically relevant. I think now if you're working on a big game project or something like AAA companies like EA has their own archival staff. They have people who are doing like archiving their projects as time goes on. I think the folks at the Video Game History Foundation have said that's also because they realize they can monetize games by like releasing remasters or things like that. So that's also a big part of it. I think with the folks I talked to, I think it may also just be that for a lot of folks it was kind of this weird blip of an era. For some folks I speak with, the multimedia stuff was a lot of money coming in, a lot of interest coming in, then things kind of drying up, and then they didn't necessarily continue in the industry. So I think maybe it's to an extent people viewing their own work as being a bit of a blip. I'm not entirely sure if that's a right conclusion to come to. But I think, but with the stuff I write about, at least, I feel like since I do kind of focus on these kind of one-off oddities or companies that kind of sprung up, made a thing, and disappeared. I just thought of a random example of like it was an educational game produced by the Sundance Institute. They got like Glenn Close to be a voice actor. I'm sure that company like was gone very soon after that produced it. And it's like I could imagine looking back on that and thinking like, well, that was weird, but not necessarily thinking about it in terms of being part of this bigger story about interactive media. If that makes sense.
It does. I mean, and not to get too meta. I mean, and maybe you would agree too that like there is like compared to like 10, 15 years ago, there's more. People, institutions, entities, like trying to do the work of documenting history and different types of history. But I mean, are there times you ever feel like with the history you're doing, like, do you feel that way where, like, do you feel like your work on these things is also just a blip?
Huh. I hope not. Well, again, because so
well, it's interesting. No, I mean, maybe I'm projecting, maybe not, because it's like, yeah, it can feel that way sometimes. I choose to not think about it, but it can, and I hope not. But yeah, it's just curious, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about wanting to see a positive change in mindset. Is that I kind of realized that what I'm doing it sort of in a vacuum. I have my blog. I have been, sort of running it myself for years. No, I have been running it myself for years and years. Not sort of. I'm running it, but
at least 10 years, right?
Yeah, I started it. 2008. And I realized it is definitely something that kind of exists, sort of in isolation. And the stories that happen there, I mean, they get picked up in other places, but they kind of exist as their own thing. I hope that to the extent that it has an impact, is driving interest in this sort of thing. In knowing that things that are outside kind of the main path of what people talk about and think about game history and game culture, that all these kind of other experiences on the margins, that these are also valuable and interesting. And I think to an extent it is a weakness of some of the work I do, that the stories I tell often aren't connected to a bigger picture sometimes. I want to try to do that more. That is something that I realize just by the way I write I don't often do. But that I hope that as interest continues to be driven towards this kind of thing, especially in this sort of like multimedia experimental era, that it can help paint a bigger picture. I realize I'm just kind of putting a lot of points on a map instead of making a map. It's been on my mind, but it's something that I'm not entirely sure how to tackle.
Well, I feel your pain. I totally understand that. So, I mean, but I think about that too, and it would be, hopefully not just interesting for the two of us to hear it discussed, but like I often wonder about that, and I talk about that a lot, about like you can keep digging into a thing, but sooner or later, like you have to pull up, you need to zoom out, you want to try to connect those dots. So for the work you're doing, like what are the dots? Like what is the bigger picture you think? Or if there have been, maybe the only sense you've gotten of it is like when you see other people pick up your work and they write about it and you feel like, you know, they appreciate it, but maybe they're not, you know, maybe you recognize like, oh, you know, they could zoom out bigger. This stuff is actually, you know, it is that, but it's blah, blah, blah. Do you have a sense of that, or is that still difficult to articulate?
I kind of do. And this sounds almost like a cop-out answer, but the bigger picture I'm slowly getting the sense of is sort of the balance or struggle between creative expression and capitalism, if that makes any sense. That I see a lot of the time that it's, you know, folks getting money and wanting to do stuff, folks wanting to make these kind of new modes of expression. You had things like the Voyager company, which was one of the early companies that made CD-ROMs. They like adapted books into computer programs. They started commissioning original artwork as well. And you see this. I spoke to the founder of it, and you could see this kind of tension between wanting to explore this new mode of expression and also realizing that it was, you know, tied to the interest in technology, and it was going to dry up, and funding was going to dry up, and that kind of balance. You get that in like any of these companies I talk to. Like the end of the story is always like, and then it wasn't successful, and we went out of business. Is kind of where the story ends in a lot of cases. and you kind of see the same pattern of like sort of like speculative investment in new technology that's that lead to this kind of creative boom that then they move on to something else, whether it's moving on to the internet or moving on to 3D graphics or something like that. My favorite story like that was it was an old like auction simulation CD-ROM game that got produced because the founder of the company, who had like minimal to no experience in games, got a big investment from like I think it was like an Armenian construction magnate who was just like, yeah, here's a couple $1 million, go make a video game, because it was like a big growing market. And it's like that's how these things got produced, was folks taking a risk on this, and then the risk in so many cases didn't end up paying off. So that's kind of, I think that's kind of the bigger picture I see, but I think I'm curious about trying to understand sort of the cohesive creative message to it too. But that's one of the overriding things.
Well, I chuckled earlier because I was going to ask what you're saying it's about, in some ways, the balance between creative expression and capitalism. I was going to ask, well, which half of that balance do you think is winning or is more pronounced? That's sort of a dopey, that's like that's sort of a leading question, because I guess maybe it's obvious, maybe it's not. But I don't know that you can necessarily chart it in that way. And so maybe, I mean, you said like this is the typical story you tend to hear. Maybe the more interesting question instead is like, in the digging you've been doing, does it help you understand where the balance is now between capitalism and creative expression? I've been thinking, actually, coincidentally, weirdly, a lot about these topics, but through the lens of how the fix has been in for media since the .com bubble, and actually ways that ties in with games. And I mean, sort of, it's a way that the fix is in, the template was set. But I feel like you probably have a much more broad, 10,000 bird eye view of understanding now, based on the fact that you've been looking at that balance for so long. Do you feel like you have like a bit of a understanding of like, well, this is why these things are happening now that maybe others don't?
I'm not totally sure if I have any unique insight to that, but yeah. I do start to notice patterns and stuff. I think the big one now, and I say this with love and respect to my friends who work in VR, is VR a lot of the time. Well, not because it's not going to pan out or anything like that, but because I see a similar sort of boom and bust happening in a lot of cases, where it's a lot of interest being driven to it from a combination of I guess external parties who see there's interest in something. a big theme that I look at, I tend to write a lot about educational games, and I've noticed there tend to be, a lot of publishers saying, like, this is how we're going to reach people. We're going to, make a CD-ROM about XYZ, and you get, like, the Smithsonian on board, or you get some other, Sundance, or whoever else comes in, makes this thing, and then when it doesn't end up panning out, or the technology just, isn't, it doesn't have the effect they wanted, they move on to something else. And that's, that's how grants work. That's how that whole ecosystem of, like, R&D and education, like, all that's how it works. And so I don't think I have any unique insight into, like, what the marketplace is with, like, new technologies emerging and investments, but you can definitely, I guess you can see echoes looking back as opposed to, like, being able to see anything predictive going forward. That you can look at something like all the interest being driven towards virtual reality and all the the interest from third parties and universities or KFC making their own virtual reality game. Like, that's absolutely, in the same family as Chevron commissioning the creators of SimCity to make a game. So, and you can see kind of how that story goes of, it's a neat thing. They put money into it. They decide to move on to something else because that was just what they spent their training budget on for that year, and then they move back to doing whatever. So I don't think there's anything predictive necessarily, but I see a lot of parallels, at least in other things booming and busting, if that makes any sense.
It does, and I think Max's may come up a few times because I interviewed Sid Meier a few weeks ago, and I'm reminded of something he said, which is, I think I asked him a question that was something like, your games have been written about for decades, and, like, what patterns have you noticed in the way people write about your games, or the way, and also, like, the way people write about games in general, and how are you surprised at what hasn't changed or what has changed? Those all sound like questions I would have asked him. And he said something about how often people are convinced that they know the future, and, like, how much of an industry there is behind, like, pretending like or sort of like like making predictions and, like, nailing them down. I mean, he had a memoir that just came out, and this was sort of the question I was going to ask you is, like, I mean, other than the obvious, I mean, like, what do you sort of attribute the rise of these sort of game dev memoirs? Because there's Sid Meier, there was a Ken Williams one not long ago. John Romero has been talking about wanting to write one for ages. I mean, my guess, not to steal an answer from you, basically, I would just say is, like, it's like, well, they're getting older. So, but I mean, there seems to be a thing happening now where these books are coming, and there are many of these books, and there are probably more on the way. Why do you think that's happening now?
Well, the easy sort of cop-out answer is that everyone's been stuck inside for the last half year, so everyone's writing books now. I don't think that's probably not the entire thing, though. I'm sure folks have been working on things for a long time, but that's something I have been thinking about. But
well, yeah, that's true. But I mean, I think I was sent Sid's book in April, and I think it just came out in September. And the Ken Williams one was a few years ago, and I don't know if the John Romero one is ever going to happen. But I think you're absolutely right, though, that, like, people are definitely feeling more introspective now. But I mean, even COVID aside, like,
joke answer aside, like, joke answer aside.
No, I'm totally with you. It's just like, well, we're just entering, like, the memoir phase of that arc of developers, and there doesn't need to be a significant reason for it, but there's definitely patterns with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the people reaching a certain age of their career, I think I mean, that's got to be a huge part of it. Like, when you look at all those folks who were developing things in, like, the mid-'80s, so if they are hitting that point, I think that's totally fair. But I think especially, Ken Williams, his book was, I haven't read it yet, but I know just from the blurbs that, like, a decent amount is about sort of what went down with Sierra toward the end, with sort of the new owners and everything that happened with that. And that one very explicitly seemed like him wanting to tell his side of the story. And I don't want to project. I don't want to, like, assume that that's what developers want. That it's them trying to tell their side of history or anything like that. But I think, looking more broadly, I think it is fair that games as a medium compared to other mediums don't necessarily have as much in terms of a historical, I think fans are writing the narrative for a lot of these things. Like Sierra especially is a company that I think there's a lot of really interested fans who document things and collect materials and stuff. And I don't want to project on specific developers of why they do and don't do things, but I think it is true that a lot of the history narratives that are told in games come out of the fan community. That's through fan documentation. That's through enthusiasts. So there may be a part of wanting to tell your own story. That may be part of it. But I don't know if anyone who is currently writing stuff feels that way. But I feel like games are somewhat unique in that way compared to film or music, where as folks have pointed out, there's so many books about the Beatles, or there's so many books about Abraham Lincoln. There's a lot of things that are written about constantly. There's a lot of coverage of, and there's so many different competing narratives about. I know games are unique in the extent to which fan communities seem to take over that conversation, and I think a lot of it, like I mentioned earlier about sort of the way that video games were written about 15, 20 years ago, the internet especially, I feel like that has set the narrative in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So if I was a developer who had worked on something on the 80s, I could understand wanting to tell my side of that story. That's the way I'll phrase it without projecting specific thoughts onto any specific person.
Yeah, no, for sure. And to be clear, and I think I wasn't asking you to speculate about any individual or their saga, their drama, their side of the story, whatever. I don't know if you've read many of these types of books. I also have the Ken Williams one, and I'm planning to talk to him, and I have not read it yet because I'm just one person doing all this, but I will soon, so I can't comment on it. But I've read a fair amount of these books. I always try to. I don't know if you have that habit, because I was just sort of curious, what are ways where, because in some ways, I absolutely agree with you with the fan perspective, and I'm not saying that they would be the sort of nebulous blob of humanity to counteract this, but you get a primary source writing an account, and in a way they are just one data point, and they are giving their perspective. And I don't know, I guess I'm just curious, have you ever read any of those types of books and felt oh boy, they're doing that same thing you and I just talked about, of they're missing the bigger picture of their own work in some way? Have you had that experience, or no? Or
so I will give an admission of me being the worst librarian ever. I am a very slow reader, and I struggle with a long form reading. I don't know. I have a tough time getting through long books. I love reading long form stuff online. I don't know. That's always been something, I think, ever since I got the reading habit kicked out of me by the standardized reading program in middle school years ago. But I think I'll go back to Maxis, because that is something I have just heavily researched, so I can make a lot of comparisons to it.
I knew it would come up again.
always coming back to Maxis.
Totally fine. Take it where you will. Yeah.
But the story of Maxis, a lot of folks often talk about Will Wright, because he was such an instrumental. He was the guy who designed SimCity and The Sims. He's often seen as the figurehead of Maxis. But the impression I've gotten from reading a lot of interviews and stuff like that is that he was kind of the creative energy for the company, that he was coming up with ideas for stuff and thinking about this kind of big picture about how all these things work together. But in terms of Maxis as a company, he was less engaged than other people were. A lot of it comes down to the CEOs that had, Jeff Braun and Sam Poole, who there's not a lot written about Sam Poole from Maxis, who cares who that is, but he helped direct their business strategy in a large part. So I think when you get a lot of these sort of well-known figureheads, I think especially with obviously Sid Meier, Sid Meier's name is in a lot of the games, so that's Sid Meier's Pirates, Sid Meier's Civilization. But I think to the extent that there was a history for a lot of these things, when you think about Nintendo, people think about Miyamoto. That there's a lot more going on. There's it's a bigger force of the creative side, interacting with the business side and the marketing side and the technology development, and how all these things I know Lane Nudie, the historian who's done a lot of research on Sierra, has mentioned all these fascinating stories about how they had offices laid out would like affect how games were developed and those kind of things. And I think like when you get the perspective from the big figureheads behind stuff, that is a valuable perspective. That is worth knowing like how they thought about their own companies, how they thought about the projects they were directing. But you also don't necessarily get, sort of the ground level view from people who were working in the company about what things were like.
Right.
And I think you get a full picture by looking at all of that. And so I think these memoirs are fascinating and useful, like seeing what some key players thought about their stuff. But it's not, I think everyone is inherently limited. You're not, if you're the boss, you're not going to know what your employees' thoughts on this thing were. So I think it's tough to get a big picture, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that's kind of that's probably why you write more than one article and I do more than one interview, and that's why, I say, they're just one data point. It's like, well, how could a person be more than that, So, I don't know, maybe this is a bit of a dry well to revisit and ask about, but and again, I agree about history narratives coming out of the fan perspective. There are other types of books too. I don't know how I mention it without it seeming like that's the sole focus, but there are imprints like, for example, like boss fight books that are out there, and so what gaps do you feel those types of publishers fill in? And then the follow-up question, of course, is, well, what gaps do you feel publishers like those further create or don't fill in?
Well, I think, and this is something I try to get with on the Obscuritory too, is one thing that I like seeing that like fan stuff fills in is where it's kind of a mesh between like the historical perspective, but it's not just recounting dates of when things happened or who worked at what company, but the way that those things mesh with people's own experiences with the game and how they enjoyed it and how the fan culture enjoyed it, and just seeing how all those things ripple out, I think is super interesting. I know like Boss Fight Books, for example, brings in a lot of people's personal perspectives on playing stuff, and I think it's exciting and interesting to see, how historical narratives can intersect with like criticism of games and stuff like that. And so I think that there's a lot of, it's interesting how fan culture does that too. Even just things like Let's Plays, where, if it's a more well-documented one where it's like people playing through a game and talking about it as they're going through it, I think people call those like scholarly Let's Plays or something like that, I think is super interesting. And a unique perspective I don't think you could get entirely if you were just talking with the folks who are running it or just trying to write like the definitive, here's the history of this game, this company. I think that's really interesting. Where I think there's a gap, and I think I mentioned this when we were sending emails, was I think a lot of this still tends to be focused a lot on sort of the more hardcore fan audience of these things. That I think, and I wish there could be more room for exploring this kind of stuff for people who aren't necessarily as engaged with games.
Yes.
I have some friends who, they play games. We used to do Rock Band together frequently, and they still do. They play Rocket League and all that, but like they're not like super gamery people. And we have this ongoing conversation about like some of this older game stuff. They're interested in it, but it's just not really accessible to them because the avenues for conversation about it tend to be, folks who have spun up their own emulators or things like that, or people who, in my case, spend all this time playing all these weird niche Maxis things or whatever. And like, it's tough to enter that conversation as someone who hasn't really been, engaged in it before, compared to something like film where there's so much, there's so much conversation, there's so much interest in getting people involved in, like quote unquote classic film. There's like the AFI and there's AMC and all these other, various avenues for interacting with historical film. And it feels like games are still missing that to an extent. It's weird to think that like when I write, I always try to think about like an audience who has generally not cared about games that much, which is weird because like I write so specifically about games and like specific eras in games and stuff. But like I do try to think about like, how can we make this kind of stuff approachable to someone who isn't already in the enthusiast network? There's already various barriers to that, like to getting into that kind of thing, which especially still today, but in the past, especially often like age and gender, those barriers hugely exists in the enthusiast world. So just thinking about other ways to bring people in, like all the people who are reading books about Lincoln aren't Lincoln scholars. They're people who are interested in this broader subject. So like
that's a very good point. Yeah.
So like I'm excited when, you know, other game historians like read the stuff I write, or like other game critics like read some of the stuff and get interested in it. But like, how do we, you know, maybe I'm not the person to reach this audience necessarily, but like, how do we talk to a bigger audience that wants to engage with games that hasn't necessarily for various reasons?
That's that's exactly where I am and what I mean by zooming out and pulling up. So thank you for articulating it a little bit better than I did, if it wasn't clear. So what are the nuts and bolts of that typically look like in your writing and in your thinking? Because I could easily talk to you about this for 2 hours about just like the ways I run into it, like even just in the last week, much less over, you know, years and years of doing this and thinking about it. Yeah.
I think, oh god, I had 2 thoughts and one of them slipped away. I'm going to chase this one and see where it goes.
Okay.
So I think part of it is jargon is kind of a big thing. I know that's not like a super like bold, exciting answer, but I feel like the games audience is writing towards the game audience and knows what's up. They assume the audience knows what's up, so they use like, you know, specific insider terminology. Like I know there was a lot of discourse recently around like the term Metroidvania and how that's become this like weird description of a genre that doesn't really have a shorter description, and people talking about like whether we should pick another term, like those kind of big questions. I feel like it's very difficult to write about games in a way that doesn't get bogged down in that kind of jargon. And it's so weird, but the first time I thought about that was in high school, writing an article for our student newspaper about Mass Effect, which I was like so big on at the time. And a friend read it and was like, "Oh, this was a great article, but what is a third-person squad shooter? What is that?" And I was like, "Oh, that was the simplest way I could think to explain that." It's like, no, like folks who aren't like immersed in this stuff don't know what that means. So just thinking about it, like in those terms, not necessarily just jargon, but just in how you talk about games in general. Like, I think the bigger point this is going to, and this is kind of a big one, is I think that the most interesting thing about games isn't necessarily the games themselves. I think I mentioned Lane Nooney earlier, but she had a really great quote about how like the most exciting part about games is how they lead us everywhere else. And I feel the same way about this too, that it's like games are interesting. They do things that are aesthetically interesting. They do things that are interesting in terms of like, you know, how you interact with ideas, their history, all this stuff. But I think they're exciting when they can point us away from just, you know, looking inward at like, oh, what's the gameplay like? When you start looking at kind of bigger questions. This is a very silly example, but I wrote about it recently, and this was kind of on my mind with this sort of question was, there was an old game called Virtuoso. It was an old shooter where it's like you play as like this burnt-out rock star dude who goes into virtual reality and kills stuff, and it's not great. But what was interesting for me, I thought was like, I don't know, the way that it interacted with like what rock culture was in the 90s, and like the way that rock culture started to get a little angrier over time, and you know, you got like Limp Bizkit and everything like that, and like just sort of seeing that transition kind of encapsulated in a game. I thought that's what was interesting about it. It's like, how do these things, I don't know, how do they speak to our own experiences? I guess that's a really broad that's a really broad way of putting it.
Well, I think back on something that a games publicist who I've worked with on things in the past in my former life as a critic. He would be the person to reach out to get advanced copies of things for deadlines and such. And gosh, I don't even know. This may have even been the same trip because it was again around GDC. But I think GDC is typically when most of my face-to-face interactions for this work even happens. Oh, yeah. But he's been supportive of these interviews I've been doing and like understands what I'm driving at, and talking about this, he said something to me which is I still think about, and I don't know how you bridge this gap. He said, what really mystifies the rest of the world, people who are not, aficionados or would not go out of their way to read about video games, what really mystifies them about video games, he said, is the way that it's like the way they become part of people's lives, or like the ways in which like people intersect with each other over them. Like I think that's why like there's such a huge explosion of like, you know, Animal Crossing coverage this year, but like there was not a similar explosion over like other things in pop culture that have a cultural impact. Like there's something about that still seems like weird or like surprising about video games, whereas I think like people who are into games are like, yeah, you know, like people people connect over them. But I think there's also a tendency for people who get it to sort of scoff at, you know, people like trying to connect these dots because things that are revelatory seem so basic, you know, and so in a way it's like these bridges never get mended because both sides are sort of mystified by the other. I don't know how you solve that, but I know it to be true.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure either, but I think to an extent it's like, thinking about history specifically with games, is that I feel like we often have the same conversations over and over where it's like, games, they're not Space Invaders anymore. Games, did you know that Mario was made in Japan? Like, I feel like it's the same kind of like, you know, reiterating the same points over and over because the conversation publicly around games has, I don't know, has seemed stuck for so long. And I think when you see a lot of the kind of like popular game discussion, like the recent Netflix documentaries, which I'll also admit I haven't noticed because I kind of didn't have a Netflix login for a while. But from what I understand, in general, they tend to have, again, kind of that bigger picture focus on, you know, some of the big stuff like the story of Space Invaders. I could be totally misremembering what the episode is about. But I feel like there is still constantly that uphill battle, and I don't want to suggest this is entirely why, but I do think a lot of it is because games are still, to an extent, having to assert their own importance. And that was kind of going what I was saying earlier about, like, when games talk happens in academia, like talking about like how financially successful games are, like how they're such a big industry, they're bigger than the movie industry is the quote that comes up a lot. And I feel like it's part of that, the extent that like games feel the need, keep having to justify themselves over and over. They've always been kind of, you know, cultural punching bags to an extent, whether it's like, you know, they're, you know, the cause of all these societal ills, you know, whatever they happen to be in any given year. I feel like games are often having to say, you know, games are interesting, games are good, games are cool, here's all the things that happen. And I think when things break out, like Animal Crossing, it's because it does connect back to the bigger world in some way. Especially with the pandemic and everyone staying at home, there's like such a strong crossover with Animal Crossing. And I think a lot of the time, like you were saying, the ways that people interact with games and the ways that people cross over with games is not as visible because it's often kind of this inside network. Like, I don't know, I'm fascinated by like the stories that happen in MMOs and online games. Like, how do we translate that out from being like, here's a thing that happened in, you know, EVE Online, how do you tell that into a bigger story that other people can connect to? I think that's something that there's a lot of folks doing that work, but has been missing for a while.
You know, I flash back on this, like there was a documentarian I interviewed a few years ago. I remember he made this, I interviewed him for this, I should, maybe that was assumed, maybe not. But I remember afterwards, like he was like, you know, it was a similar dance card for me, or like very perplexed at like why I wanted to talk to him because he doesn't know anything about games. I explained I'm really interested in talking about like parallels and like when there are points of intersection, like I'll articulate them and see if anything relates. And he was just, you know, like just run through the whole thing of like, well, I don't know why you want to talk to me, but all right. And then we go way over past the time we had allotted, and he's like, oh, this was actually really interesting. And then he said this thing which was not, I mean, it's not off the record or anything. It's just we had stopped, we had wrapped up.
Yeah.
And he was just saying like, you know, I wish in some way that like you could tell who was a video game fan the way you could tell who's a music fan, because like you can go to a festival and you see a bunch of music fans, or you see people out, you know, and they have like a Metallica T-shirt. I mean, it is true that like a big part of engaging with video games is like portable gaming aside and COVID aside is like generally you're at home behind a screen. But I also think that there's just like I think that's true and it's an interesting way of looking at it, but also it's like we're not like being it's like being defined by these categories. It's like, well, but people like music and video games. People like movies and video games. It's not like there's a talk of it where it's like there are on Earth there are human beings, and then there are creatures who look like people, but they like video games, and they are different. Like, I feel like that is still out there. Maybe not articulated as such, because probably people who think that way don't mean it in that way, but also don't think about it beyond this, like, problem people like you and I are presenting to them, or want to present to them, of like, hey, did you ever think about video games?
Well, it goes to that, like like the definition of gamer, which I know is something that is endlessly relitigated over and over and over, but it does sort of define this, like, specific category of, like, are you a gamer? Are you into games? Like, it's like being a skater or something. Like, it's the specific niche activity, hobby you do, as opposed to just being, like, something you do in general. And my friends I mentioned who are, play games but aren't, like, gamers, like, that's something they sometimes think about too, was like, that there often tends to be an assumed audience for games, like the gamer audience, that they don't necessarily fit within. They don't really know is not the right word, but how do you fit games into your life when there seems to be such an interest from the people who market games and define game culture in, like, having this specific identity of being a gamer? I'm sure there are folks who, like, do studies about, like, identity in games who can speak to this much, much more, so I don't want to really go into it because I'm assumed they are way more qualified than me to talk about this.
Sure.
But it's a thing. Like, it's, yeah.
Well, you had mentioned, maybe this is some of what you meant by, like, hardcore, gamers, is you had a desire for older games not just to be thought of as retro gaming. And so I think this is some of what you were talking about before. But, like,
yeah.
what's lost by not stretching how we think about older games?
I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about some of the, like, insularity of some of this, that I think and I know in my email I think I even used scare quotes around retro gaming, but to me, like,
I have it in quotes here, yeah.
Yeah. Well, retro gaming, like, to me, that suggests a specific mode of operating where it's people who maybe are nostalgic, maybe want to collect things, and are sort of, like, revisiting this bygone era and are kind of looking at it from the top of the hill, like, whoa, look at retro gaming, look at this. Like, it's that kind of specific, like, folks who have Ghostbusters t-shirts. Like, it's that kind of specific niche of who's playing games. But I may have made, I think this is only my second film comparison so far. I work in media in a library, so that's why I often make film connections, but
yeah.
I think about the extent to which you can, like, visit a book from the 70s or a film from the 70s and not have to be actively engaged in that sort of, semi-nostalgic mode for interacting with games. And so I think it limits the audience to an extent. I think you get kind of this, re-cementing effect where, people look at older games and say, oh, that's not for me, because, there's a specific audience in mind that's kind of, dominating the discourse around that. And there's other barriers too, like the fact that these, emulators are so difficult to run and things like that. But I think it when you think about, like, and this is a cynical example, but, like, Atari, like, whatever, like, weird creature is wearing the skin of Atari right now that's, like, making Atari cryptocurrency and Atari hotels and whatever. Yeah. That's, like, so clearly, like, preying on a nostalgic audience for stuff. Like, I think that's, you could look back at a lot of older game stuff and kind of get that sort of impression that that's kind of what the bigger picture of it is, which maybe is a little cynical, but I think that if you're on the outside of it, that might be how it looks. I think it's worth finding ways to say that, like, this stuff is interesting, and there are technical barriers. That's one of the toughest ones. But, like, as there's more things like the Internet Archive is, like, turnkey, click a button on a browser and you can play a game emulation. Like, the barriers are starting to get a little lower and lower as time goes on, and just finding ways to speak to a bigger audience besides just that specific. I don't know. I feel like when you're just talking back to the same audience over and over as time goes on, it just becomes, it shrinks. It becomes smaller than itself. It becomes this, the audience becomes a little more calcified. It has less opportunity to grow and go somewhere else. And like I said, I think these things are interesting when they can connect with people more broadly, when there's a wider potential audience. People bring their own interests and perspectives into it. I think that's where games really excel. And, if you're just selling the same Atari stuff back to the same people for 30 years, I don't know that you can do that.
Well, I was going to ask about this anyway, but you actually brought it up a few times, which is about, I mean, you even said, I think, in the email, like, you don't want to draw comparisons to film. But I think it's an interesting question.
I mostly said
sorry.
that because I didn't want it to be my crutch. Sorry about like the thing I was depending on the interview. Excuse me. But Maxis ended up being that during the interview, so we're good. We're okay. I already have some other thing I keep going back to.
No, you're good. You're good. Well, no, I mean, and I actually didn't even connect it with the question I had in mind. Like, to me, it's an interesting question because I feel like, I guess I said I already do this or have done this in other interviews, which is like looking, like drawing comparisons, looking for parallels in other mediums, and I don't know that I do that anymore, and sometimes I feel like, and you're a librarian and you're a historian and you are a researcher, and like, so, I mean, like, how can you tell when, like, drawing parallels to games elsewhere, like, is it a context where, like, it stops to be helpful to, like, understand games and what their potential is? Like, so a couple weeks ago I fell down a random YouTube hole and was watching a bunch of Dick Cavett interviews, and he had like Mel Brooks and Robert Altman and some other people. It was all directors, Peter Bogdanovich, and so this was like in the 70s, and Robert Altman was talking about literally the same thing about how movies are movies are too steeped in what came before. How can they ever be their own thing if they're too focused on like what worked on stage or what worked in frames as paintings. And I feel like when people talk about this stuff in video games, like people's eyes just totally gloss over. So I was pretty surprised. Like Robert Altman's talking about it, Dick Cavett seemed to understand it, but like, I don't know, like, does it reach a point where just like a deeper understanding of the past no longer really helps us shape tools for the future, you think? I think it's a basic yes/no question. I think it's more like, I'm not posing the question to you, but like, what do you think? Yeah.
Well,
if you know a yes/no, that would be totally fine.
Well, I'm trying to think of how to frame this because, and you're talking about like, I'm trying to think how to interpret the question. You're talking about like, is there an extent to which we can't look back at the past of games as a way to like figure out what we want in the future? Is that?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't think I would ever say it's like, well, do we reach a, like it's like a diminishing returns thing, but it in some ways I think can also be looked at like, in some ways I think it surrenders some agency over who we are now and what we can do with things, and I think maybe also, I mean, I don't know, I don't even know who the question is really posed to here. I think like for some creators too, it's like there can be that thing too of feeling like, well, I can't do this because someone else did this, blah blah blah, in the past. But I think like I've thrown it out to just lots of different like curators and people in other disciplines of like, it's probably harder to pose the question in such a blanket way of like, what can games learn from movies or what should they not? It's like maybe that, okay, maybe I'm answering my own question here, sorry. But maybe it's more a question of like, how do we get more granular in what we're looking to the past for, but then who's we? So I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here, but it's interesting because it's like, well, I don't think in film they feel like they've cracked it. So, yeah. And I guess games do place a lot of importance on like films are the thing to emulate or to be mistaken as or the thing to brag about having made more money than. So movies loom large in these conversations even when we don't want them to, right? Because they shape so much of what we see.
Well, I think one thing, and this is kind of tangential, but I'm thinking about like in terms of how we relate back to past games and whether that is something that is holding us back or is a way forward. And I think a lot about sort of the the new generation of folks who are coming into gaming who are I don't want to say Gen Z specifically because I'm sure it's broader than that, but specifically I'm thinking about there's a specific horror game called Baldi's Basics that came out a while back, and it's super interesting to me because it's like it's kind of following the current template of horror games where it's like you walk around and collect objects before the evil monster thing gets you, but it's copying some vague aesthetics and tone from like old 90s CD-ROM educational games, and it's very like different from what those are. Like it's definitely, it's like someone coming to those who was born 10 years after they came out, who is now like reinterpreting that in their own way and running off with it. And I think that's super interesting. I think, or like the what are the videos that are out there? It's like the Mario 64 creepypasta videos where it's like the weird, creepy old cartridges. And it's like, these are coming from folks who don't have any nostalgic attachment to this thing, don't have any sort of like, this is what was happening in this era. Like, they are drawing on the aesthetics of it. They're taking what they want out of it and building something new. I think that's interesting. I think I differentiate that from something like retro gaming, because retro gaming, I think, is very self-celebratory in a lot of ways. That it's like, it's looking back at the past and celebrating it and saying, like, this is where we came from, this is the stuff that matters, this is what was exciting to us. Versus this, where it's almost just like appropriating parts out of some old games and old game culture, or turning it into something new that means more to themselves. I think that's potentially really interesting.
Well, you're talking about, and I think if we're talking about the same thing, like I have run into that Mario 64 stuff that you're talking about, and I've also noticed like there's just like a preponderance of like, I think this is some of what you're talking about, like with the lack of nostalgia is like there's just like when I see, I think you see it a lot on like Simpsons stuff, for example, or Simpsons YouTube poop or whatever, where it's just like just
Simpsons
constant.
wave.
Yeah, thank you. Just like constant, VHS warping effects on stuff where, well, that technology didn't exist in that way yet, or that problem was actually already solved. Where it's like, I think maybe that's some of what this is when it pertains to video games. Is a fear of actually not understanding what the past was and just glossing over it in some sort of disrespectful or like, I mean, whatever, not in like a, I mean, but like, yeah, I mean, like it actually does maybe harm things too, though, right?
It's weird. It's like I'm kind of of two minds of it. It's like on the one hand, I believe strongly in his
I just seesawed between the two of them. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with
like
you.
I believe strongly in historical context. I think these things, like looking back at some of these, the weird old game stuff I write about, matters so much more when you think about like who was playing it and why was it made, and kind of getting that big picture. But then I can also appreciate when folks look to something like this and aren't necessarily interested in repeating the past or having to, answer to some existing narrative about why something happened, and just kind of pushing it in their own new direction. And I think there may be, maybe it's possible to find something between that, maybe not, but it's like, I don't know, historical context matters a lot, but I can also understand how people, would be stymied. If you're looking back at some like 90s CD-ROM stuff, and I say like, well, you can't appreciate all the 90s CD-ROM stuff until you play the 1989 Beethoven CD-ROM, and I end up on this like big like Frasier-like monologue about understanding what the CD-ROM means and how that could be off-putting, and I totally understand that too. I don't know, I guess is my answer, but I can understand how both those things are valuable, both in terms of understanding what the past is and where things came from and interpreting some of this older stuff in a meaningful way, but also in wanting to move past that and not feeling, chained to what came before and the culture that existed before gaming.
Well, I think there could be a way for, historians and lay people and just people in general, like there certainly can be a way we can navigate this as people who care about video games to not be the equivalent of being like, oh, you call that jazz? There hasn't been, Benny Goodman, that's jazz. What do you know? Which I guess is some of what you're saying with Frasier, but it's like, I guess it's extra weird too, because it's like video games tend to still be associated with like, maybe the median age is rising, but it's still typically associated with younger people. And so to be seemingly so old in mind, still so young, I don't know what that says, but it feels like that's got to be a preventable thing, right? And maybe I feel like, but then the only salve for that is like, we should just be more connected to the past then, right? Or not so precious about it or something.
I'll mention one specific example that gives me a lot of hope. So there's a Japanese multimedia artist, Osamu Sato, who did a lot of really interesting work during this era. I think he did LSD Dream Emulator is kind of his most well-known game. He did Eastern Mind, which I mentioned earlier, the game with the big green head. So he did a lot of that kind of experimental multimedia game stuff. And there is a sort of a community around his work now, and it's both like appreciating it historically and like what he did, especially at the time, but also wanting to build it out in a new direction. He's still around. The artist is still around. He's constantly remixing his old music and putting out new albums, and it's this really interesting fusion of like folks who are interested in his work historically, wanting to play his old games and talk about them and draw, the themes from them and whatnot, at the same time as also taking inspiration from it and going in their own direction. Osamu Sada's works are kind of uniquely vibrant and transcendent in a way that, isn't necessarily the case for, all sorts of games. They're kind of, I don't want to say specially, that's such a weird word, but they're different. But it's interesting to see how you can have a new generation coming up that both appreciates and interprets the past and then kind of uses it for their own means and goes off in new directions too. I think that's one, I think, particularly positive example.
I'm trying to think if I have any other questions. I mean, I think one other thing we can get into is, and I don't know how awkward a transition this is, but
go for it.
I don't know that I'm really that concerned about seeming awkward in these. That ship has sailed. But you talked about for gaming publications, like you would like to see a push against self-mythologizing and sort of this way, as you put it, like how all of gaming has gotten compressed into the widest one-size-fits-all audiences. And you said what's sort of missing in media is sort of like a local media frame. And so I'm not asking you, hey, how do we fix media? But I would be curious to hear more about, like, if you could elaborate on that, sort of like what you're imagining. I mean, is it like local in terms of like, because I think the ways we structure it now is tied around like how much money has gone into it, and that tends to dictate like what gets attention and what doesn't, and it's like things that are perceived as small, things that are perceived as big. Like certainly there are at least other ways to break it down and approach it. What did you have in mind?
Well, to be specific, because I realized it was just kind of in the email we were exchanging, but when I mentioned like local game publications, I was thinking in terms of like, national news versus local news, whereas instead of just looking at the biggest possible things, where it's like looking at, whatever the biggest stories happen to be, but looking at some sort of smaller, interesting, or some specific region. And I'll say I don't have any answers about how that works in terms of, paying people or anything like that. I've got nothing. I don't know enough about like the publication industry to speak to that. But what really inspires me is seeing like smaller communities and sort of like smaller focus on what you're writing about. Whether it's like, I think one really great example is the CRPG Addict. He's a blogger who he is a blogger who has been trying to play through every computer role-playing game like ever, and is documenting his adventures doing that, and it's great. It's like someone really specifically honing in on it, and there's this really tight audience around it that's fascinated by it. And I think something like that might be more of a way forward. I think there's smaller critical publications that are doing a lot of really great work. I think I mentioned places like Uppercut was one of them that are doing this sort of like, let's focus on, I don't know, a more narrow subset of criticism, not just having to write about like, here's my impressions of the new PS5 launch titles, but instead, I don't know, honing in on some specific voice even. It could even just be as different as a voice. But I think I'm really rambling here. But I think having more opportunities to hear different voices in games besides just kind of reporting what is happening at the broadest level matters a lot. I think in terms of representation it matters a lot, but just in terms of like, I don't know, finding a way to relate to the game that's not just the greatest hits headlines, if that makes sense.
It does.
I kind of weirdly honed in on voice here, but like even just thinking about like a game like Hades, like there's not a lack of coverage for Hades. That's a huge game right now, but I feel like there are folks approaching it from so many different perspectives that there's kind of the mainstream press of reviewing it and then reporting on the memes that come out later about Hades, but then there's also sort of this other critical perspective. I know there's all kinds of like gender lenses to analyzing Hades especially, and it's like I think there's merit in cultivating more places, even if they're just hobbyist outlets, where those kind of specific perspectives, hard to say, can thrive. I don't want to mythologize. I kind of like that word, I guess. The like early 2000s internet, because as we mentioned, that had a lot of issues in terms of voice. But I think when people were writing their own websites and had a smaller message board, I think that led to a cultivation of voice, even if it was kind of terrible in some places. And I think it's worth trying to figure out how we can have that sort of cultivation of voice in a specific place again. Obviously, social media has kind of flattened everything, so we're always talking to everybody at all times. But I think it's worth trying to find a way to talk about games from a different voice and a different perspective, and give people a different way to approach it, rather than having to write for the broadest possible audience at all times, which I feel like is how the sort of big games media has operated for years. That was I don't even know what I was saying at a certain point. I was just rambling.
Oh, it's no, I follow. You're good. Don't worry.
I'm the kind of person who gets up and paces when I talk, so that's yeah.
It's all good. Well, I don't know if I have any other. I mean, I have one last question here for you, at least. Was there something else you wanted to get into that we didn't touch on? Because I know, as you said, we obviously did jump around just in the course of conversation here.
I think the only thing that was kind of in my mind as we were having this conversation was something I kind of mentioned earlier, was just kind of the intersection of history and criticism and all that, because I feel like on the topic of voice and publications, I feel like there can often be a sort of a separation between those things, that there's I don't know, when I think about game history work, I often tend to think about, again, people just doing sort of this tome-like research on documenting the story behind things, and then there's another group that's engaging with things from a critical perspective, and I think there is some room to overlap those things. I don't totally know what that looks like, but I feel like they're maybe boss fight books, like we were mentioning earlier, that sort of interplay and intersection of those different ideas, kind of moving back and forth between them. I know that's something, even as we were having this conversation, that was kind of in my stuck in my mind, was how do we get those things to coexist together? How do we get the historical context to exist with trying to appreciate a game and get the themes out of it? I guess that's something I think about a lot when I'm writing, that even as we were having this conversation, that still just kept popping up about how do we bring those things together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I had answers too.
Me neither, and I realized
well, I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was saying I realized I almost sounded like that was a scripted answer, but it was just something that's, for me, I just here's this thing I've been thinking about. Let me tell you about it for a couple sentences. But I wasn't thinking about it in those terms necessarily. We just kind of that bigger picture of a lot of this, a lot of our talk is focused on the historical research side and getting perspective from developers, and it's I think sometimes the games I write about also do have some kind of big themes, and I don't know. I think there's room for a lot of those things to intersect that doesn't seem to happen enough, I think. And I just wonder, when we talk about trying to branch out the voice publications and finding more ways to interact with games, that maybe there is some sort of in the same way that, here we go with a film comparison again, but in the same way that you can watch a film and talk about its aesthetic and artistic merit at the same time that you can talk about the Hollywood system and how all these things collide together, what that looks like for games. I guess I really want to know about that, and whether that's going to be, whether that could be a way to engage people who aren't necessarily the gamer audience, like we talked about. Maybe, I'm not sure, but just, again, as we talked, things that were popping in my head about those kind of bigger questions.
Yeah. Well, so here's one big final question. What do you think video games have accomplished?
Whew.
They've accomplished woof.
Woof. Sure, they have. There's a lot of dogs in games. They're good dogs.
Yes.
You
can pet some of them, I understand.
Many of them are petable.
Yes, many. More every day.
This is giving me a lot of time to stall on this answer. Thank you.
That's what I'm doing. Don't you? Now you're calling attention to it, so I'll be quiet.
Well, I think that a lot of... Where am I even trying to go with this? I'm thinking about what we mentioned earlier with the fact that fan culture plays such a large role in documenting and to an extent preserving these games, or at least just kind of keeping them alive in some kind of cultural historical sense. I think games... obviously games have this kind of unique quality of being interactive, and when folks, look towards games critically or making games, they're always trying to think of some way to bring that out in a way that other mediums can't do. but I feel like it carries over into the way that they're sort of received over time and memorialized too, if that makes any sense. That I feel like the extent to which, and this could also just be from the fact that companies are, not the greatest custodians. Big game publishers haven't been super great custodians of their work historically, but the extent to which fan documentation and fan culture and, things like people's blogs or putting things up in the Internet Archive, the extent to which that is a major part of the story of games, I think is super interesting. I think the fact that, there's so many historical games, so many stories about how games were played, that all that kind of exists because of the people who play them in a way that doesn't necessarily happen for movies, or I keep saying movies, but for any other medium, really. I think about, I have a friend who is, more immersed in the fighting game community and has mentioned, someone he knows up in Michigan who has, old, mini DV tapes of, fighting game tournaments that were happening in Michigan or something like that. And that's fascinating to me. That, it's this almost an intersection of, art and sports, kind of the way that fan culture has become a major part of the story of games. And maybe it's weird to say that's something games have accomplished, but if you think about games in a broader sense of involving the fans and involving the people who care about them, yeah, I think they've accomplished something in terms of this collaborative culture that is pretty unique. And that has implications for how we talk about things historically and culturally, but it's I don't know, that's kind of what always excites me, is seeing how those things come together in a way that's not just necessarily, whatever the publisher sanctioned the story is about stuff, that the fans' involvement, and even the fact that fans care about things years later, is as much a part of the story in some cases as the development of the game itself. I think that has what games have done uniquely, to me, at least.